Just over an hour's drive west of Calgary sits Banff National Park. The first and still the finest of all Canada's national parks. Banff's bustling town site is an oasis of civilization surrounded by untamed wildlife. Spectacular wilderness begins barely 500 meters in any direction. But hosting almost 4 million visitors a year means Banff must balance the infinite complexities of a vast ecosystem with the heavy footprint of the modern world.
In the early days, it was all about creating a civilization, as it was all wilderness. Now it's about protecting wilderness as civilization is getting closer and closer.
Banff National Park holds a significant place in Canadian history. What began in 1885 as a 26 square kilometer slice of the Canadian National Railway's territory has now grown to encompass nearly 7,000 square kilometers of mountains, meadows, and wildlife. Banff National Park was born as a direct result of the expansion of the railroad and the push to unify the country in the late 1800s. Decades later, the building of the Trans-Canada Highway would help bring in more people. And come they did. For the mountain climbing, for the supposed healing waters of the hot springs, and for the abundant wildlife. Some things haven't changed in more than a century. The mountains are still incredible. The wildlife's still amazing. The springs still hot. With the winterizing of the hotels in the late 1960s, Banff in the winter has really taken off.
From outside of our hotel, we have hundreds of kilometers of hiking trails. We've got fantastic world-class ski resorts in Lake Louise, Sunshine Village, and Mount Norquay.
Most areas report annual snowfall ranges in excess of 400 centimeters, making Banff a diverse winter playground.
Here it comes.
But the mix of mountains and tons of snow comes with one of the biggest risks in the backcountry.
It's going big, John. John, leave the camera, John. Leave the camera, run.
Anytime you put snow on a slope, there is potential for avalanches. Depending on the variations in the layers or the variations in the snowpack, you can get stronger or weaker snowpacks, and the addition of more snow or rapid changes in temperature, anything like that, any changes in the snowpack can create instabilities, and then avalanches can occur. Quite often, they're triggered by people simply skiing or walking on them.
Banff Park Dispatch. Où est votre urgence? What is the exact location of your emergency?
To deal with the risks of avalanche within its mountain parks, Parks Canada has a comprehensive search and rescue program.
Hi, this is Banff Dispatch.
Yes, it is.
I've got an avalanche report to make.
Okay.
Shoal Valley, just on the first crossing on the backside of Fairview there. Starts 2.5 to 3, 2 involved. Both buried, one self-extracted, the other one was...
They perform a few hundred rescues every year, from sprained ankles to serious medical emergencies in the backcountry.
Avalanches tend to come in cycles, so last week we actually went through a fairly significant avalanche cycle where there's some natural avalanches running, some of them all the way to the valley floor, so pretty big avalanches, what we call size 3s or bigger, that would, demolish your car. But typically for people that have accidents in the backcountry, hopefully it's a smaller sizes 2 to 2.5, but still have pretty significant consequences. You're pretty fragile as a human being, so if you get buried for a significant amount of time or pushed through some trees, you're going to get hurt or worse.
The danger is obvious, but there are ways to mitigate it. Park staff promotes self-reliance. To inform users, they issue daily avalanche bulletins and safety information.
Leaving the ski area and entering the backcountry is not necessarily a bad thing, and that's not prohibited or discouraged even. The only thing we tell people is if you're going to do that, then you should be prepared for that.
If nature throws you a curveball and you do get into trouble, they will rescue you. Whether that means being plucked off the side of a mountain by helicopter or pulled from beneath an avalanche by searchers and rescue dogs. Mountain highways that cut through the park sit in prime avalanche paths. Keeping them clear for travelers is another challenge for the Parks Service.
We provide avalanche control services to the avalanche paths that threaten the highway, and in Banff Park it's the avalanche paths on the Sunshine Access Road and the Banff-Jasper Highway, and we also deal with the Trans-Canada and Yoho and the Kootenay Highway.
If there's an avalanche risk, the highway is closed. Then, in what might be the coolest job in the world, park staff drop bombs on the snowpack from a helicopter, triggering a controlled avalanche. The highway that runs through Banff is not just any road, it's the main transcontinental artery. And having a major highway bisect a national park presents a deadly barrier for wildlife.
The Trans-Canada Highway has on average 17,000 vehicles per day. In the summertime, it's 25,000 with peaks up to 35,000 vehicles per day. And that translates to one car passing every 3 seconds. So you can imagine how difficult it is, not just for people to cross a highway like that, but also for wildlife.
To give the animals a hand and negate the impact of the highway, they've created a network of overpasses, underpasses, and wildlife corridors. There are currently 24 crossings, spaced out approximately every 2 kilometers. Combined with exclusion fencing that runs the entire 45-kilometer stretch of highway, the crossing structures shield animals from passing traffic and divert them from entering into town. They've
reduced collisions with elk and deer and moose by more than 96%. That is from over 100 elk vehicle collisions a year to down to less than a half dozen. For all large mammal species in the park, it's greater than 80% reduction. So huge reductions by having these measures in place.
Remote camera systems and track pads help biologists monitor animal movements and behavior patterns. But pictures and track marks can't tell researchers exactly which animals are using the crossings. It could be the same wolf or bear going back and forth 100 times a year. To determine individual identity, researchers use a non-invasive barbed wire technique to capture DNA from hair samples.
We found that there were a dozen different grizzly bears using these crossing structures, and the most surprising part and promising part is that it was 50-50, male and female. It wasn't biased towards male movement across these structures. So in essence, these crossing structures have been able to obliterate the impacts of the highway for grizzly bears.
Though bears are the focal species, the research shows all kinds of animals are using the crossings. Grizzlies, black bears, cougars, wolves, elk, moose, deer, even chipmunks.
Species have their preferences. We found that grizzly bears, wolves, elk, and deer and moose prefer large structures, not just structures like this wildlife overpass, but also big open-span bridge underpasses, whereas black bears and cougars prefer the exact opposite. They prefer these structures that are more constricted, that are darker, provide a lot of cover.
Since monitoring began in 1996, more than 180,000 animal crossings have been recorded. Current plans will see even more crossings implemented as highway reconstruction work continues in the area. But there are some challenges which are even bigger than the park itself. Off the northern fringe of Banff National Park sits one of the most spectacular and accessible ice fields in Canada. The Columbia Icefield, an otherworldly environment that screams out to be experienced. As a plateau, it's about 25 kilometers long and about 15 kilometers at its widest. It creates a giant mass of snow and ice that's approximately 200 square kilometers. Feeding out of it are 7 major glaciers. The Athabasca Glacier is its most famous. When first explored decades ago, it was an ordeal just to reach it. Today, the Icefields Parkway has made the tongue of the Athabasca Glacier within easy reach. Peter Lemieux and his good friend George have been escorting people on the Icefields for years.
Up beyond there is what we would call the accumulation zone, where more snow falls than melts. It's basically the ice factory. Snow builds up year after year, and what you end up with is a transition from snow to ice, and then it begins to slowly move down the valleys. So what you've got coming from the ice field is the Athabasca Glacier here. You can see at the head of the valley it's quite rough as it goes over cliffs, forming ice falls. The lower part is really smooth because the valley underneath is flat.
Glaciers are constantly on the move. In recent years, they've been receding a lot faster than they've been advancing.
Well, the interesting thing is that the first time I saw this glacier was about 1964, and the ice was pretty much where I'm standing now. Since then, the glacier has retreated back probably 400 or 500 meters. But not only has it lost length, it's lost thickness, it's lost volume.
The relation of the glaciers with the environment and the impact of their loss is ringing alarm bells around the globe.
And what we're starting to see as these glaciers shrink is that the peak flow in the rivers in late summer, when it's dry everywhere, is diminishing. So it's not that we're going to lose the rivers, but we're losing an important source or an important segment of the flow at really critical times of the year. So everything comes back to being connected. And if we don't preserve places like this, we're going to lose everything.
One of the more extreme visitor experiences that takes place around the Icefields Parkway is ice climbing. In winter, there is no shortage of frozen ice falls to tackle.
With ice climbing, it's a lot of it is a head game. You basically just have to be confident in your ability to get up the ice and your swings and your kicks. The ice can break off, but generally, as long as you've got a good tool placement in one hand and you find another good tool placement with the other hand, then you'll generally make progression up the ice.
There are limits to what is possible depending on conditions.
For some people, it's the cold. Some people don't really care how cold it is. Also, you have to think about the stability of the snow and what you're going to be climbing underneath or what you might have to cross to get to the ice climb.
The ice climbing season here can last 6 to 7 months, providing more than enough opportunity for any climber to take themselves to the limit. Banff National Park is now one of the most visited national parks on the planet. In 2008, it recorded nearly 4 million visitors in 1 year alone. The Banff Town site is nestled well within the park's borders, complete with indoor shopping malls, traffic, housing shortages, and a state-of-the-art water treatment plant. If you want to come and live here, good luck. Permanent population is capped at 10,000 residents. By federal regulations, individuals must be employed in the park to live in town. It also has fixed borders with no option to grow outward. Development in the park is a hot topic. It always has been, and it all goes back to 1883.
The real beginning of Banff National Park, of course, was the railway, and it was 3 railway workers that saw this great steam coming up from the ground, kind of shimmied down this tree that was down the hole and discovered the Banff Hot Springs. So now the National Historic Site, Cave and Basin.
The 3 men had found what they dubbed liquid gold. They knew co-workers would be willing to pay for a nice hot bath in the soothing mineral waters. This would be their ticket to fortune.
But what they ended up doing was they built what's considered the first hotel in Banff. Right here in this little space, they built for what they could find, some wood or mud, and they built a shack, and on the door they had hotel. And so that was our first hotel in Banff.
With a plan to preserve the landscape and generate income for the growing country, the Government of Canada compensated the men, took over the land, and set aside an initial 26 square kilometer area around the hot springs. This would become Canada's first national park. Under the leadership of Cornelius Van Horn, the Canadian Pacific Railway would bring in the tourists. On June 1st, 1888, the Banff Springs Hotel opened its opulent doors.
If you arrived in those days, for $3.25, you could stay at the Banff Springs Hotel, and for 5 additional cents, you can come out here and enjoy this nice warm water. And it became a very, very popular place.
Swimming in the natural thermal pools was banned in the mid-1980s. Swimmers were inadvertently damaging the fragile hot springs ecosystem. The Banff Springs snail thrives in this environment, and it's the only spot in the world it exists.
What we're doing right now is we're testing water chemistry. And what we find in these springs is that there's really low levels of dissolved oxygen. And so that limits plus the warm temperatures, what type of life forms can survive in these very harsh environments. So it's part of the regular monitoring. We just are concerned about, want to see how populations fluctuate seasonally and also how the water chemistry also changes.
About the size of a small lemon seed, the snails are easily affected by human activities. These spots are strictly off limits.
What we found is if we don't wipe out our tracks, people see a set of tracks there. Oh, somebody else has been there, so if they've been there, so why can't I go there?
An illegal swimmer could wipe out an entire population. Even residue of soap or deodorant could contaminate the mineral springs, destroying snail eggs. From tiny snails to grizzly bears, from backcountry skiing to ice climbing. Within its boundaries, Banff National Park contains a sampling of Canada's greatest natural assets. Its uniqueness and importance was recognized internationally in 1984 when Banff, together with the other Canadian Rocky Mountain parks, was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These spaces exist so that people can visit them. Maintaining the balance between visitors and the health of the park ecosystem is an ever-evolving challenge.
The town is not moving, but how can we live with wilderness? We have to compromise, and we get to see these amazing animals out here, and we wanted them to be healthy. We wanted them to be continuing being part of the national park. We want to maintain that wilderness.